As dense forests receded and fertile plains emerged, the stage was set for a technological revolution in northern Europe. At the close of the Neolithic period, the Nordic region consisted of a mosaic of forested highlands, river valleys, and coastal plains. Paleoclimatic studies indicate that between 1700 and 1500 BCE, the climate experienced a relatively stable temperate phase, with slightly warmer summers and milder winters compared to preceding centuries. Pollen analyses from peat bogs and lake sediments in southern Sweden and Denmark reveal the gradual retreat of dense mixed forests, including oak and beech, and the expansion of open woodland and arable land. This transformation allowed early communities to establish permanent settlements along rivers, lakes, and fertile lowlands. Archaeological evidence confirms that early Nordic communities preferentially settled near rivers and streams, where water access supported both agriculture and transport. Excavations at Hjortspring in southern Denmark demonstrate the proximity of settlements to navigable waterways, while contemporary sites in Skane reveal a network of small farmsteads integrated into the surrounding landscape. Soil analyses indicate a mixture of loamy and sandy substrates suitable for cereal cultivation, which facilitated the early adoption of mixed farming systems. Animal husbandry, including cattle, sheep, and pigs, complemented crop cultivation and supported the maintenance of permanent settlements. The region's geography also provided access to critical raw materials, which would later underpin the Bronze Age economy. While local sources of copper were limited, the distribution of tin and copper from Central Europe became essential for early metallurgy. Archaeologists have documented the arrival of bronze artifacts in southern Scandinavia during this period, suggesting that trade networks were already active. The presence of imported goods, such as metal axes and ornaments, indicates that Nordic communities were strategically positioned to acquire and disseminate materials from distant regions. The coastal geography of the region further influenced settlement patterns and mobility. Fjords, inlets, and sheltered bays offered natural harbors, enabling waterborne transport and trade. Sites such as Hjortspring reveal evidence of dugout canoes and other watercraft, supporting both inland and coastal movement. River systems functioned as communication corridors, connecting dispersed farmsteads and facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultural practices. Forests and wetlands also shaped subsistence strategies. Dense woodlands provided timber for construction and fuel, while bogs and marshes supplied resources for weaving, thatching, and occasionally ritual deposition. Archaeological excavations in these areas have uncovered tools, wooden structures, and organic material preserved in anaerobic conditions, allowing detailed reconstruction of daily life and resource management practices. The interplay between open farmland and forested terrain created a diversified landscape that supported both settlement expansion and resource exploitation. In addition to natural resources and navigable waterways, the topography of southern Scandinavia influenced early social organization. Fertile plains and river valleys encouraged clustered settlement, while upland areas and forests provided natural boundaries for territorial differentiation. Evidence from burial mounds and longhouses suggests that communities organized themselves around key geographic features, which later contributed to the development of localized hierarchies and cooperative labor projects. By the end of this period, the Nordic environment had undergone a transformation that combined fertile soils, navigable waterways, and access to both local and imported resources. Archaeological and paleo-environmental data collectively demonstrate that these geographic and environmental conditions provided a stable foundation for early Nordic Bronze Age society. The availability of raw materials, arable land, and transport routes facilitated technological adoption, including the introduction of bronze, while supporting the growth of permanent settlements and nascent social structures. The combination of fertile plains, forest resources, and waterways created conditions conducive to technological and social advancement. These environmental advantages directly facilitated the introduction of bronze metallurgy, setting the stage for more complex social hierarchies and regional networks that would define the early Nordic Bronze Age. Long-distance trade and cultural exchange introduced new metals, motifs, and social hierarchies to Northern Europe. During the late 18th and early 17th centuries BCE, the Nordic region became increasingly connected to broader Central European and Baltic cultural spheres. Archaeological evidence indicates that migrations and sustained contacts introduced new material culture and technological knowledge. Settlements in southern Scandinavia show the arrival of imported bronze axes, daggers, and ornaments, many of which correspond in style and composition to artifacts from the Unitas culture of Central Europe. Chemical analyses of bronze items reveal tin and copper sources consistent with southern European mines, confirming long-distance trade and exchange networks. The Egtved burial in Denmark provides one of the most illustrative examples of early cultural contact. Dating to approximately 1370 BCE, the grave contains a young woman interred with a bronze belt plate, ceramic vessels, and textiles exhibiting stylistic similarities to Central European patterns. The preservation of organic materials, including wool and birch bark, allows researchers to trace weaving techniques and dye usage, demonstrating technological transfer as well as the adoption of foreign ceremonial practices. Such high-status burials indicate that imported objects were integrated into local social hierarchies, reinforcing emerging elite structures within the Nordic communities. In addition to material imports, stylistic influences extended to weaponry and ornamentation. Bronze daggers and swords excavated from sites in Skane and Zealand display typologies closely aligned with tumulus culture artifacts from the Danube region. These parallels suggest that not only objects but also craft knowledge and symbolic design elements traveled across substantial distances. The adoption of these motifs indicates selective integration, where Nordic artisans adapted foreign designs to local preferences and societal structures, creating a distinct regional Bronze Age style. Trade and cultural exchange were facilitated by both land and maritime routes. Archaeologists have documented coastal and riverine settlement patterns that align with the movement of imported bronze. Dugout canoes and simple harbors enabled transport along fjords and estuaries, while inland rivers connected southern Scandinavia to the Baltic and North Sea networks. Evidence from chemical isotope studies of metal artifacts demonstrates that raw materials and finished objects were transported over hundreds of kilometers, linking northern communities with Central Europe, the British Isles, and the southern Baltic region. Migration also played a role in these early cultural connections. Burial sites and settlement patterns indicate episodic movement of peoples, likely in the form of small kin groups or specialist craftsmen, bringing technical knowledge and material culture with them. These movements contributed to regional differentiation in artifact styles and the spread of metallurgical skills, particularly in areas with limited local metal sources. Archaeological evidence suggests that imported bronze served as both a functional material and a status symbol, reinforcing social stratification in Nordic communities. The integration of imported technology and motifs facilitated the development of new forms of social organization. The presence of prestige items in elite burials suggests that material exchange reinforced hierarchies, while stylistic adaptation of foreign designs indicates active participation in broader cultural networks. Settlement evidence from sites such as Hjortspring and southern Swedish farmsteads shows increasing complexity, including coordinated longhouse construction and fortified compounds. These developments reflect the influence of external models on local societal organization, setting the stage for the establishment of permanent communities with differentiated social roles. By the end of this period, the Nordic Bronze Age had absorbed and adapted significant technological and cultural innovations from Central European and Baltic contacts. Imported bronze and stylistic motifs were no longer merely exotic goods. They became integrated into local craft, ritual, and social practices. The resulting synthesis laid the foundation for a distinct Nordic Bronze Age identity, while simultaneously connecting the region to a larger network of Bronze Age Europe. The adoption of imported knowledge and material culture directly catalyzed local metallurgical development and supported increasingly permanent settlements. These foundations enabled the rise of more complex social structures, which would define the political and economic organization of the early Nordic Bronze Age. The glow of bronze reshaped Northern Europe, transforming tools, weapons, and status symbols. By approximately 1500 BCE, bronze-working technology had become increasingly widespread in southern Scandinavia, marking a fundamental shift in both material culture and social organization. Archaeological evidence indicates that communities in Denmark and southern Sweden began producing bronze objects using imported copper and tin, while gradually developing local smelting and casting techniques adapted from Central European models. Analysis of hoards and grave goods demonstrates a standardized alloy composition, typically consisting of approximately 90 copper and 10 tin, indicating controlled production processes and an understanding of metallurgical properties. Excavations at workshop sites, including areas near Jortspring and various locations in Skane, reveal the presence of crucibles, molds, and slag deposits associated with early bronze production. These findings confirm that local artisans not only replicated imported designs but also innovated techniques to suit regional resources and functional requirements. Tools such as axes, knives, and sickles were produced alongside ceremonial items including daggers, belts, and ornamental fittings, highlighting a dual focus on practical utility and social display. Laboratory analyses of residues from these sites further indicate repeated casting operations, suggesting that metallurgy was becoming a specialized craft controlled by skilled practitioners. Grave goods from this period underscore the role of bronze as both a functional material and a marker of status. Burials containing bronze weapons or adornments are disproportionately associated with elite individuals, often accompanied by ceramics, jewelry, and imported items from Central Europe. For example, the discovery of bronze swords and axes in Skane and Zealand reveals standardized weapon typologies and production techniques, suggesting coordination between artisans and elite patrons. The differential distribution of bronze items among burials indicates that control of metal resources was closely linked to social hierarchy, with wealth and technological access reinforcing authority. The adaptation of bronze-working techniques also reflects interaction with broader European networks. Stylistic analyses of daggers, axes, and fibulae indicate influence from the tumulus culture and Unettis horizon, which had established metallurgical traditions in the Danube region. Archaeometric studies of metal composition confirm that copper ores were imported from Central European sources, while tin likely arrived via trade routes from the British Isles or continental Europe. This combination of imported raw materials and locally developed casting techniques illustrates an early instance of technological hybridization, where foreign knowledge was adapted to meet the demands of Nordic communities. Technological innovation was accompanied by refinements in production methods, including the use of bivalve molds for standardized shapes and repeated casting to increase efficiency. Bronze hoards from southern Scandinavia reveal both finished tools and scrap material, suggesting that communities maintained stockpiles of metal to support production and exchange. Archaeologists have also documented signs of experimentation, including alloy variations and attempts at surface treatment, indicating a process of trial, error, and incremental improvement over several generations. The ability to manipulate alloy composition, along with controlled casting techniques, reflects a growing understanding of metallurgy as both an art and a technical discipline. The social implications of bronze production extended beyond burial practices. Communities with access to metallurgical knowledge were better positioned to equip warriors, construct tools for agriculture, and produce prestige items that reinforced authority. Sites near Jortspring, for instance, display evidence of both weapon production and associated settlement activity, suggesting integration of craft production into broader economic and social networks. Artifacts such as bronze sickles and axes not only increased efficiency in farming and forestry, but also served as exchange commodities, facilitating trade and the accumulation of wealth within emerging elite households. In addition to functional and symbolic applications, bronze metallurgy shaped settlement patterns. Workshop sites are often found near rivers or coastal areas, taking advantage of water for transport and trade, as well as for cooling during casting processes. The geographic placement of these production centers aligns with known trade routes, demonstrating the interconnection between technological innovation, economic activity, and regional interaction. Chemical analyses of metal artifacts recovered from burials and hoards confirm that metals were circulated widely, reinforcing networks of dependency and communication across southern Scandinavia and beyond. By the end of this phase, bronze-working technology had become both a practical and a social instrument. Its presence structured settlement organization, reinforced hierarchical structures, and facilitated economic exchange. Archaeological findings, including workshops, hoards, and grave goods, collectively demonstrate that mastery of bronze was central to the rise of early Nordic Bronze Age society. Metallurgical skill enabled both economic and military advantages, spurring trade networks that would increasingly define social and political organization. These developments set the stage for the expansion of elite authority, integration into continental exchange systems, and the growth of specialized crafts, all of which contributed to the emergence of the complex Nordic Bronze Age society in the subsequent centuries. Northern Europe became a conduit for materials flowing across the continent, connecting Scandinavia to the Mediterranean world. By the middle of the second millennium BCE, southern Scandinavia was increasingly integrated into extensive trade networks that connected northern communities to Central Europe, the British Isles, and the broader Mediterranean sphere. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that essential metals, including tin and copper, were transported over hundreds of kilometers to support the emerging Bronze Age economy. Chemical analyses of bronze artifacts recovered from burial sites and hoards confirm that copper originated predominantly from Central European sources, while tin was likely imported from Cornwall and other Western European regions. These imports were critical for sustaining local bronze production and supporting both practical and ceremonial needs. Amber, abundant in the Baltic region, became a highly valued export commodity, traded for metal resources and other prestige goods. Excavations at hoard sites such as Skane and Zealand indicate the deliberate accumulation of both bronze and amber objects, often carefully curated in wooden or ceramic containers. These hoards reflect not only the material wealth of the region but also the structured nature of long-distance exchange. Isotopic and compositional studies show that Scandinavian amber reached as far as the Mediterranean, while bronze ingots and finished objects flowed northward, highlighting a two-way system of economic interdependence that spanned much of Europe. Coastal and riverine settlements emerged as central nodes in this exchange network. Sites located along fjords, estuaries, and major rivers functioned as hubs where metalwork, agricultural surplus, and luxury items were collected, processed, and redistributed. Archaeologists have documented evidence of wharves, docking areas, and remnants of watercraft, including dugout canoes, which facilitated the transport of goods between inland communities and the open sea. Settlement patterns suggest a deliberate positioning of production and storage centers to maximize accessibility to trade routes, reinforcing both economic and social hierarchies. Material evidence underscores the organizational complexity required for sustained long-distance trade. Large-scale hoards often contained both raw metal and finished artifacts, indicating coordinated procurement, storage, and distribution. For example, hoards discovered in southern Sweden include bronze axes, swords, and jewelry, alongside imported copper ingots. The uniformity of alloy composition across widely separated sites suggests centralized knowledge of metallurgical standards and the presence of skilled craftsmen capable of processing diverse raw materials. Such coordination implies the involvement of elite individuals or groups who controlled access to resources, oversaw production, and managed exchange networks. Beyond metals, the exchange of stylistic and cultural elements accompanied material trade. Scandinavian artifacts exhibit motifs and forms influenced by Central European cultures, particularly the tumulus and Unettis cultures. Imported goods were frequently adapted to local tastes and incorporated into burial practices, ceremonial displays, and elite consumption. These patterns illustrate how trade was not solely an economic mechanism, but also a vector for cultural and technological diffusion, reinforcing emerging social stratification within Nordic communities. The geographic configuration of southern Scandinavia facilitated this integration into continental networks. Coastal fjords provided sheltered access points, while navigable rivers enabled movement into interior regions. Archaeological excavations demonstrate that settlements often combined residential, craft, and storage functions, allowing communities to participate effectively in long-distance exchange while maintaining subsistence and social organization. The spatial distribution of artifacts, combined with chemical and isotopic analyses, confirms that these communities were both producers and intermediaries within a complex web of trade extending across Europe. By the end of this period, Northern Europe had become a critical conduit for metals and other valuable materials, linking local communities to far-reaching trade networks. The flow of tin, copper, and amber facilitated technological development, wealth accumulation, and the reinforcement of social hierarchies. Archaeological evidence indicates that trade was carefully managed, integrated with settlement planning, and instrumental in shaping the economic foundation of the early Nordic Bronze Age. Trade wealth reinforced emerging elites, enabling monumental constructions, ceremonial activities, and centralized control over resources. The combination of imported metals, local craftsmanship, and organized exchange set the stage for the development of increasingly complex social, political, and ritual structures, forming the backbone of Nordic Bronze Age society in the following centuries. From scattered farmsteads, coordinated regional networks began to emerge, laying the groundwork for proto-states. By the early 14th century BCE, southern Scandinavia witnessed the emergence of increasingly organized political units. Archaeological evidence indicates that river valleys and coastal corridors became the primary axes around which communities consolidated. These locations offered strategic advantages, combining fertile land for agriculture, access to waterways for trade and transport, and natural defensive positions. Excavations along the Vistula and southern Swedish river systems reveal clusters of longhouses, storage facilities, and defensive earthworks that suggest coordinated settlement planning. The distribution of these structures indicates a shift from isolated farmsteads toward interconnected communities capable of joint action. Fortified settlements from this period provide tangible evidence of growing social coordination. Sites such as early hilltop enclosures in southern Sweden and Zealand feature palisades, ramparts, and ditches designed to protect both residents and valuable resources. The construction of these fortifications required organized labor, resource allocation, and technical knowledge, demonstrating the presence of leadership capable of mobilizing and directing communal effort. Archaeologists have identified post-hole patterns, timber remains, and gate structures that imply standardization in defensive architecture, suggesting the spread of shared building knowledge across neighboring communities. Longhouse complexes also illustrate the integration of domestic and administrative functions. Large, rectangular timber structures served multiple purposes, including housing extended kin groups, storing surplus crops and metal goods, and hosting communal activities. Settlement surveys indicate that these longhouses were often aligned along central axes, with clear planning evident in spacing, orientation, and relation to water sources. Such organization implies emerging governance mechanisms to manage land distribution, resource allocation, and communal obligations. The coordination of labor extended beyond domestic and defensive structures to ceremonial constructions, including burial mounds and stone settings. Excavated mounds in southern Scandinavia, some exceeding 20 meters in diameter, required significant manpower for earth transport, timber framing, and stone placement. The repetition of mound construction across regions points to shared social norms and the ability of emerging leadership to direct large-scale projects. These activities simultaneously reinforced social hierarchy and territorial claims, providing a physical manifestation of authority within and between communities. Trade networks further reinforced proto-political organization. Settlements positioned along rivers and coastlines functioned as hubs where imported metals, amber, and crafted goods were collected and redistributed. The control of these trade nodes conferred economic and political power, enabling certain individuals or lineages to assert influence over broader territories. Evidence from hoards and distribution patterns demonstrates that access to imported bronze, tin, and luxury items was closely tied to elite households, linking material wealth with emerging authority structures. Defensive coordination also reflects early forms of intercommunity alliances. The spatial arrangement of hill forts and fortified farmsteads suggests strategic placement to control movement along rivers and valleys. Archaeological surveys reveal communication between settlements, including signal lines and shared construction techniques. These patterns indicate that groups were not acting in isolation but were participating in cooperative arrangements that likely involved mutual defense, resource sharing, and regulated trade. Population growth and agricultural intensification supported this process of political consolidation. Stable cereal yields, supplemented by livestock, allowed communities to sustain larger populations, which in turn required more formalized organization to manage labor and resources effectively. Excavated storage pits, granaries, and livestock enclosures provide evidence for centralized management of surplus production. The ability to coordinate food distribution and labor not only reinforced social cohesion but also strengthened the authority of emerging leaders who could oversee complex economic and defensive systems. By the end of this period, southern Scandinavian communities had transitioned from loosely organized farmsteads to proto-political networks structured around river valleys, coastal routes, and fortified settlements. Archaeological evidence demonstrates the establishment of coordinated labor systems, controlled trade, and centralized management of both domestic and ceremonial projects. These developments created the structural framework necessary for the formation of complex religious, cultural, and social institutions in the subsequent phases of the Nordic Bronze Age. Consolidation set the stage for complex religious and cultural systems, where emerging political authority would integrate ceremonial practices, elite ritual, and material symbolism to reinforce social cohesion and regional influence. Chieftains and ritual specialists emerged as central figures, guiding both the material and spiritual realms. By the 13th century BCE, the Nordic Bronze Age exhibited increasingly formalized hierarchies, evident in both burial practices and settlement organization. Excavations in Denmark and southern Sweden reveal elite graves containing bronze weapons, ornamental belts, jewelry, and imported items, including daggers and pins from Central Europe. These burials often occupy prominent locations within settlement landscapes or atop burial mounds, signaling both social prominence and control over communal resources. The distribution and richness of grave goods indicate that leadership was closely tied to access to valuable metals, trade networks, and ceremonial authority. Material culture associated with elites reflects the intersection of political and ritual power. Bronze swords, axes, and ceremonial fittings were not only functional or decorative. Their deposition in graves or hoards conveys status and symbolic authority. The alignment of these artifacts with warrior iconography on rock carvings and metal ornamentation suggests that chieftains were also perceived as military leaders. Excavated sites such as the Egtved girls' burial further highlight the ceremonial dimension of elite authority, where ritualized interment and imported goods reinforced lineage legitimacy and reinforced social cohesion within and between communities. Evidence from settlements demonstrates the administrative role of elite figures in resource allocation and labor coordination. Longhouse clusters and fortified compounds often include storage areas for surplus crops, bronze artifacts, and imported goods, suggesting centralized oversight. Leaders likely directed both agricultural production and metallurgical activity, ensuring adequate supply for domestic use, ceremonial functions, and trade. Archaeologists note that elite involvement in these processes reflects a structured hierarchy capable of managing economic, political, and religious functions simultaneously. Religious leadership appears closely integrated with political authority. Sites containing ritual deposits, such as bog offerings of bronze axes, ornaments, and animal remains, indicate that ceremonial specialists or chieftains performed formalized rites. These rituals reinforced social hierarchy by linking divine sanction to elite decision-making. Rock carvings depicting processions, ships, and sacrificial imagery, often located near settlements, suggest that elite figures orchestrated public displays of ritual, connecting spiritual authority to political control. The distribution of prestige goods supports a model of hierarchical governance. Hoards containing finely worked bronze objects, amber, and imported materials are frequently found in association with elite residences or central ceremonial sites. Their controlled distribution implies decision-making authority over both material wealth and access to socially significant resources. Isotopic and metallurgical analyses confirm that metals originated from distant sources, indicating that elites managed participation in regional and continental trade networks, further consolidating their influence. Elite authority also extended to military coordination. Burials containing weapons and associated iconography indicate that chieftains commanded warriors and oversaw defensive and offensive operations. Hilltop enclosures and palisade compounds suggest strategic placement to protect both settlement populations and valuable resources. Archaeological patterns demonstrate that military oversight was an integral part of elite responsibility, complementing economic and ceremonial leadership. By the end of this phase, political and religious authority had become closely intertwined in Nordic Bronze Age society. Chieftains and ritual specialists were central to governance, controlling resource distribution, orchestrating ceremonial life, and managing participation in trade and defense. Archaeological evidence from southern Scandinavia provides a clear picture of hierarchical decision-making that shaped both material culture and social norms. Authority structures enabled cultural standardization and ceremonial development, laying the groundwork for regional cohesion. Centralized leadership provided the organizational framework necessary for shared ritual practices, coordinated settlement planning, and the codification of symbolic motifs that would define the Nordic Bronze Age's emerging cultural identity. The dead were commemorated with bronze and timber, signaling both reverence and social hierarchy. By the early 12th century BCE, burial practices across southern Scandinavia had become highly codified, reflecting both social differentiation and ritual significance. Archaeological excavations at sites such as Egtved, Haga, and Borum Eshoj reveal a variety of mortuary customs, including mound burials, stone cists, and cremation pits. The choice of burial form often corresponded to the individual's status, with larger mounds and more elaborate grave goods associated with high-ranking individuals. The careful placement of grave goods and orientation of the interred further indicates that funerary practices were governed by established cultural norms. The Egtved girl burial, dated to approximately 1370 BCE, provides one of the clearest examples of ritualized interment. The young woman was interred in a small wooden coffin within a mound, accompanied by a bronze belt plate, a set of wooden containers, and textiles preserved through anaerobic conditions. Chemical analyses of her hair and remains reveal dietary patterns consistent with elite status. The inclusion of imported goods demonstrates connections to broader European trade networks and suggests that social prestige was both inherited and reinforced through mortuary display. Haga in central Sweden offers another example of elite burial practices, with large stone cists and grave mounds containing bronze weapons, ornaments, and ceremonial items. Excavations show that these graves were constructed with significant labor, involving timber frameworks and stone placements that required organized coordination. The distribution of grave goods also indicates gender differentiation, with weapons and warrior accoutrements frequently associated with male burials, while adornments, jewelry, and ceremonial textiles appear in female graves. Such patterns highlight both the social stratification and the codification of roles within Nordic Bronze Age communities. Stone cists and smaller mounds, such as those found at Borum Eshoj, illustrate the broader spectrum of burial forms. Here, the arrangement of skeletal remains, along with accompanying bronze axes, pins, and ornaments, indicates a deliberate selection of objects intended to mark social standing and facilitate posthumous commemoration. These sites also display evidence of multiple interments over successive generations, suggesting that family lineages maintained territorial claims and reinforced social memory through repeated ritual deposition. Cremation, though less common in the early Nordic Bronze Age, appears in certain contexts alongside inhumation, particularly in areas with limited soil suitable for mound construction. Ashes were sometimes placed in urns or ceramic vessels and deposited within mounds or stone-lined pits. The combination of cremation and inhumation across regions demonstrates flexibility in mortuary practice, while maintaining the symbolic framework of status differentiation and ancestor veneration. The use of grave goods reflects both practical and symbolic considerations. Bronze weapons, axes, and daggers served as markers of martial capability, while ornamental items such as belt plates, pins, and jewelry indicated wealth and social position. Organic materials, including textiles, wooden containers, and occasionally food offerings, were also included, preserving evidence of daily life and ritualized care for the deceased. Archaeologists note that the quantity and quality of grave goods directly correlate with the social hierarchy evident in settlement patterns, confirming that mortuary practices functioned as a reflection of political and economic structure. Spatial organization of cemeteries provides additional insight into social systems. Larger mounds are frequently located on elevated terrain or near settlements, suggesting both visibility and territorial claims. Clusters of smaller burials surrounding elite mounds indicate subordination or kinship networks, demonstrating how mortuary landscapes reinforced social stratification. The orientation of graves, placement of objects, and repeated ritual activity also suggest codified beliefs regarding the afterlife and ancestor worship, integral components of emerging religious ideology. By the end of this period, burial customs across southern Scandinavia had evolved into a highly structured system that reflected both social hierarchy and ritual practice. Mortuary landscapes, grave goods, and construction techniques demonstrate the integration of material culture with religious expression. Archaeological evidence from elite mounds and common cemeteries indicates that funerary practices were central to social cohesion, territorial claims, and the symbolic articulation of power within the Nordic Bronze Age. Burial customs illuminate the symbolic framework that underpinned broader religious and artistic expression, providing the context for subsequent development of iconography, ceremonial spaces, and regional ritual landscapes. Carvings in stone and bronze encoded a cosmology of sun, sea, and status across the Nordic landscape. Throughout the Nordic Bronze Age, symbolic expression was a central element of both ritual practice and elite communication. Rock carvings, petroglyphs, and small-scale bronze figurines provide a rich visual record of belief systems and social hierarchy. Sites such as Tanum in western Sweden preserve thousands of petroglyphs depicting ships, chariots, sun motifs, and various animals. These carvings, often arranged in complex sequences across cliffs and boulders, indicate a codified visual language that communicated cosmological and socio-political ideas to contemporary communities. Ships constitute one of the most prominent motifs, appearing in both rock art and bronze miniatures. Archaeologists interpret these images as representations of both literal maritime activity and symbolic journeys, potentially linked to trade, migration, or the afterlife. Petroglyphs from Tanum frequently depict vessels with multiple oarsmen, suggesting knowledge of seafaring organization, while bronze figurines illustrate similarly detailed craft. The integration of ships into ceremonial and burial contexts implies their role as symbols of social mobility, elite power, and control over maritime routes, linking visual expression to economic and political authority. Chariot and wheeled vehicle motifs are also common in both rock carvings and small bronze models. These images often accompany solar and martial symbols, suggesting associations with ritual performance, seasonal cycles, and military display. Excavated figurines from southern Sweden display detailed harnesses and wheel designs, while carvings show chariots transporting figures of apparent status. The recurrence of this motif across regions indicates a shared symbolic framework in which mobility, power, and cosmic order were intertwined. Sun motifs, typically circular or radiating in form, dominate many petroglyph panels. These representations are often combined with ships, animals, or human figures, suggesting a connection between solar cycles, fertility, and human activity. Scholars note that the consistent placement of sun imagery at prominent sites implies ritual observation of solar patterns, potentially linked to calendrical or agricultural timing. Bronze belt plates and decorative fittings also incorporate sun symbols, reinforcing their centrality in elite ceremonial life and material culture. Animal imagery further contributes to the symbolic landscape. Deer, horses, and birds are frequently depicted in rock carvings, often in dynamic postures or in relation to ritual vessels. These motifs may represent fertility, seasonal abundance, or sacred intermediaries, integrating natural observation with religious ideology. The juxtaposition of animals with human and solar imagery reflects a cosmological system in which the natural and supernatural realms were visually interwoven, conveying societal norms and ritual priorities to observers. The spatial arrangement of carvings and figurines underscores their function as markers of territorial control and social communication. Petroglyphs are often located near travel routes, waterways, or elevated terrain, where visibility ensured transmission of symbolic messages. Similarly, bronze figurines and decorated objects found in graves or hoards convey authority, status, and alignment with ritual practices. The repetition and consistency of motifs across regions suggest both local variation and broader cultural standardization, linking visual language with socio-political networks and elite oversight. Iconography also reflects an interplay between daily life and ritual ideology. Representations of agriculture, trade, seafaring, and martial activity are integrated into ceremonial imagery, suggesting that visual culture reinforced both practical and symbolic knowledge. By encoding cosmology, seasonal awareness, and social hierarchy into durable materials, communities communicated and reinforced complex belief systems across generations. Petroglyphs, ceremonial objects, and elite grave goods collectively demonstrate the deliberate use of imagery to articulate social and religious order. By the end of this period, symbolic expression had become an integral component of Nordic Bronze Age culture. Rock carvings, bronze figurines, and decorative motifs encoded information about solar cycles, maritime activity, fertility, and elite status, creating a coherent visual and ideological framework. Archaeological evidence indicates that these symbols were not merely decorative. They functioned as tools for social communication, ritual performance, and territorial assertion, reinforcing both spiritual beliefs and hierarchical authority. Iconography influenced ceremonial spaces and guided the evolution of trade and military display, shaping the material and visual culture of the Nordic Bronze Age. The consistent use of motifs in both public and elite contexts linked religious cosmology with political authority, establishing a framework for the development of complex ritual landscapes and societal organization in subsequent centuries. Fields and herds became the backbone of prosperity, sustaining both people and the elite's ambitions. Between 1000 and 800 BCE, southern Scandinavia experienced significant developments in agricultural practice that underpinned economic stability and social complexity. Paleoethnobotanical analyses indicate that cereal cultivation expanded beyond basic subsistence crops, with evidence for barley, emmer wheat, and rye appearing in settlement contexts. Soil studies and pollen cores demonstrate that open fields near river valleys and coastal plains were systematically cleared, indicating deliberate land management and field rotation practices. The introduction of iron-tip digging tools toward the end of this period further improved soil preparation and yield potential, enabling communities to support growing populations. Animal husbandry played a complementary role in sustaining settlements and generating surplus. Faunal remains from sites in Zealand and southern Sweden reveal structured breeding of cattle, sheep, and pigs, reflecting selective husbandry practices designed to maximize milk, meat, and secondary products such as wool. Analysis of age and sex profiles in faunal assemblages indicates planned culling schedules, demonstrating an advanced understanding of herd management. Horses were also present, primarily for transport and ritual purposes, while domesticated dogs supported livestock oversight and protection. The combined cultivation of crops and management of herds contributed to a stable food base capable of sustaining both ordinary households and specialized laborers. Longhouse architecture facilitated the integration of storage, domestic, and livestock functions. Excavated structures often measured between 20 and 30 meters in length, with internal divisions for human habitation, granaries, and stabling. The spatial organization of these longhouses reflects coordinated planning, with elevated platforms or compartments designed to protect grain from moisture and pests. Evidence of repeated rebuilding and expansion demonstrates that settlements were maintained over multiple generations, supporting sustained agricultural productivity and the accumulation of surplus. The presence of surplus had direct implications for social stratification. Larger households or compounds capable of storing and distributing agricultural resources often correlate with evidence of elite material culture, including imported bronze artifacts and prestige goods. Control over surplus enabled certain families or lineages to assert influence within the community, allocating resources to support ritual specialists, craftsmen, and warriors. Archaeological data show that storage pits and granaries were often located near elite residences, suggesting that resource management was a central aspect of emerging hierarchical structures. Paleoenvironmental studies indicate that crop diversification and selective animal husbandry also mitigated risks associated with climatic variation. Communities in southern Scandinavia maintained a mix of hardy cereals, legumes, and small livestock, which provided both food security and tradable commodities. Surplus grain and livestock products were likely exchanged along regional networks, linking agricultural productivity to broader economic systems. Archaeobotanical evidence from storage pits and settlement layers confirms repeated cycles of planting, harvesting, and redistribution, underscoring the organized nature of these early farming economies. Agricultural intensification also enabled population growth and settlement expansion. Census of longhouse clusters and spatial distribution of settlements along fertile valleys suggest a gradual densification of communities, with farmsteads positioned to maximize access to arable land and water resources. The concentration of labor in specific regions facilitated cooperative construction projects, including fortifications, burial mounds, and storage infrastructure. These developments reflect the interdependence between agricultural productivity and societal organization, where surplus enabled coordinated communal effort and long-term planning. By the end of this period, southern Scandinavian agriculture had evolved from subsistence-level farming to a structured and productive system capable of sustaining economic specialization. Crop diversification, systematic animal husbandry, and integrated longhouse design created conditions for surplus accumulation, social differentiation, and population growth. Archaeological evidence from settlement layers, faunal assemblages, and paleoethnobotanical samples demonstrates that this economic foundation underpinned both elite authority and broader societal stability. Agricultural surplus enabled participation in long-distance trade and the accumulation of wealth, providing the material basis for expanding exchange networks. The reliable production of food and livestock products supported specialized craftsmen, facilitated the circulation of bronze and prestige goods, and reinforced the economic and social hierarchies that characterized the Nordic Bronze Age. The workshop became a center of power, producing both tools and symbols of status. By the early 9th century BCE, bronze production in southern Scandinavia had reached a level of organization that reflected both technological sophistication and socio-political oversight. Archaeological excavations at sites in Zealand, Skane, and southern Denmark reveal concentrated evidence of workshops, including slag deposits, casting molds, crucibles, and unfinished objects. These production areas demonstrate that metallurgical activity was not sporadic but a specialized craft integrated into the broader economy. The systematic nature of bronze working suggests that artisans possessed both technical knowledge and access to imported raw materials, including copper from Central Europe and tin from Western regions such as Cornwall. Workshop evidence shows repeated casting operations, with molds for axes, daggers, and ornamental items found in stratified layers. The standardization of shapes and alloy composition indicates controlled production methods, reflecting both functional requirements and aesthetic conventions. Analysis of crucibles and slag demonstrates a nuanced understanding of smelting temperatures and alloying techniques, which allowed craftsmen to produce consistent bronze suitable for both practical use and ceremonial purposes. These innovations were often adapted from Central European prototypes but modified to meet local stylistic and functional preferences. Craft production was closely linked to elite patronage. Many workshops are associated with settlements displaying evidence of hierarchical social organization, including large longhouses and fortified compounds. Control over the production of bronze allowed elite households to manage access to prestige goods, regulate trade, and reinforce social stratification. Objects produced in these workshops were not only functional, such as agricultural implements or weapons, but also symbolic markers of status, displayed in burials, hoards, and ceremonial contexts. The integration of metallurgy with elite oversight demonstrates the centrality of craft production in political and economic organization. The scale and distribution of production sites suggest the existence of both local and regional production networks. Certain settlements specialized in manufacturing ceremonial items, while others focused on utilitarian tools for agriculture and warfare. Chemical and isotopic analyses of bronze artifacts confirm that raw materials were brought in from distant sources, processed in regional workshops, and then distributed across southern Scandinavia. This organization reflects a coordinated system in which technical knowledge, resource management, and economic control were linked to social authority. Bronze smithing techniques included casting in stone and clay molds, hammering, and annealing, often in sequence to produce complex objects. Artifacts such as swords, axes, pins, and belt plates exhibit high levels of craftsmanship, with precise decorations and functional design. These items required specialized knowledge of temperature control, alloy composition, and mold preparation, demonstrating that metallurgy was a skilled profession. Excavations also reveal evidence of experimental techniques, including variations in alloy ratios and surface finishing, indicating ongoing local innovation alongside the adoption of imported methods. Craft production contributed directly to economic and social stability. By supplying both practical tools and prestige goods, workshops enabled the redistribution of wealth and reinforced hierarchical structures. The accumulation of finished objects in hoards, settlements, and elite burials illustrates the integration of craft production with trade, ritual, and political power. Artisans were thus essential participants in the economic network, providing the material basis for both daily life and ceremonial display. Archaeological surveys indicate that workshops were strategically located near transportation routes, including rivers, coastal inlets, and major overland paths. This placement facilitated access to raw materials, ease of distribution, and integration with regional and long-distance trade. The combination of surplus production, elite oversight, and logistical planning highlights how metallurgical activity reinforced both economic interdependence and social hierarchy across southern Scandinavia. By the end of this period, bronze workshops had become critical centers of technological, economic, and social influence. The production of tools, weapons, and ornamental items under elite supervision reinforced trade networks, facilitated ceremonial display, and strengthened political authority. Metallurgical craftsmanship thus operated at the intersection of technology and power, supporting the continued development of Nordic Bronze Age society and laying the foundation for increasingly complex regional interactions. Surplus production and craftsmanship reinforced trade networks across Europe, connecting southern Scandinavian communities to broader continental systems of exchange. These networks facilitated not only the movement of raw materials and finished goods, but also the transmission of technological knowledge, stylistic conventions, and social norms that shaped the trajectory of Bronze Age society. Still decades away, bronze became both protection and prestige. By the early 9th century BCE, southern Scandinavian communities had developed a range of weaponry that reflected both technological skill and emerging social hierarchies. Excavated artifacts from settlements and hoards include bronze swords, axes, spears, and ornamental shields. Typological analyses show a progression from simple functional tools to standardized weapons with ceremonial and status-related designs. Grave goods frequently include finely crafted swords and axes, often associated with elite male burials, indicating that martial capability and social prestige were closely linked. Hill forts and palisade settlements provide further evidence of defensive planning and localized conflict. Elevated sites in Zealand, Skane, and central Sweden feature timber palisades, ditches, and ramparts designed to protect both populations and valuable resources. Archaeologists note that construction techniques display regional standardization, suggesting the transmission of defensive knowledge and coordinated labor. These fortifications also functioned as symbols of elite control, asserting authority over surrounding settlements and trade routes. Bronze weaponry reflects both functional and symbolic considerations. Axes and spears, while practical for combat, were often elaborately decorated, with inlaid patterns or stylized motifs that indicated social rank. Swords, in particular, were rare and prestigious, often deposited in hoards or burial mounds to signal elite authority and martial prowess. The dual role of these weapons, as tools of war and markers of status, demonstrates the integration of military capability with social and political organization. Evidence of localized skirmishes is suggested by defensive structures and patterns of settlement distribution. Hill forts were frequently positioned to control river crossings, trade routes, or fertile valleys, providing strategic advantage and territorial oversight. Archaeological surveys indicate that some forts were only periodically occupied, implying seasonal or conflict-driven mobilization rather than permanent garrisons. These findings suggest that warfare in the Nordic Bronze Age was selective and organized around elite competition rather than massed armies. Shields and protective equipment, though less commonly preserved due to perishable materials, are inferred from iconography on rock carvings, bronze figurines, and occasional wooden or leather fragments. These images depict warriors carrying large, circular shields and participating in processions or battle scenes. Combined with physical evidence of swords and axes, this suggests that martial training and readiness were embedded within elite households, with specialized warrior roles supporting both defense and prestige display. The distribution of weapons across settlements further indicates centralization of martial resources under elite control. Hoards containing multiple swords, axes, and spearheads are often associated with longhouse compounds or elite mounds, demonstrating that resource management extended to armament allocation. Chemical analyses of bronze confirm that these weapons were produced from imported copper and tin, emphasizing the role of trade and elite coordination in sustaining martial capacity. Bronze weapon production and defensive architecture were also connected to broader social structures. Elite households were responsible for overseeing both craft production and military readiness, linking control over material resources with authority over territory and population. The integration of weaponry into burial practices and ceremonial hoards reinforced the association of martial skill with social hierarchy, while fortifications demonstrated the capacity to defend both wealth and political influence. By the end of this period, southern Scandinavian societies had established a system in which bronze weaponry and defensive structures were central to territorial control and elite authority. Archaeological evidence shows that martial capability was both practical and symbolic, serving as a tool for protection, social stratification, and political consolidation. Military capability supported territorial control and reinforced elite authority, laying the foundation for organized regional networks, ceremonial displays, and coordinated responses to both internal and external challenges in the Nordic Bronze Age. Rivers and coasts became highways of power, linking military prowess with regional influence. By the late 9th and early 8th centuries BCE, communities in southern Scandinavia increasingly leveraged waterways and fertile river valleys to extend their influence. Archaeological evidence suggests that military activity was not limited to local defense but included organized raids and campaigns designed to secure resources, control trade routes, and assert territorial dominance. Hill forts, palisade settlements, and strategically located longhouses reveal a network of defensive and offensive positions, enabling elite-led groups to project power across both inland and coastal regions. Weapon hoards deposited near fortifications and along river systems indicate that arms were accumulated for coordinated campaigns rather than sporadic skirmishes. Analysis of hoards from Zealand, southern Sweden, and Jutland shows concentrations of bronze swords, axes, spears, and shields in locations that coincide with access points to navigable waterways. This spatial patterning suggests planning and strategic intent, allowing warrior elites to respond quickly to threats, secure resources, or project influence over neighboring communities. The reuse and redistribution of weapons within these networks further reflect elite control of martial resources and the centralization of military authority. Settlement patterns reinforce the interpretation of territorial consolidation. Communities were frequently established on elevated terrain, near river junctions, or along key coastal routes, providing both defensive advantage and control over movement and trade. Archaeologists note clusters of fortified sites with intervisibility, implying coordinated communication and strategic planning. These locations allowed elites to monitor trade, enforce authority, and mobilize warriors efficiently, reflecting a structured approach to territorial expansion rather than random conflict. Elite burials and ceremonial deposits provide additional insight into organized military activity. Graves containing multiple weapons, accompanied by decorative items and imported goods, suggest that warriors were recruited, trained, and rewarded within hierarchical structures. The integration of martial and ritual elements highlights the social legitimacy of expansionist activity. Successful campaigns reinforced elite prestige, while ritualized deposition of arms and valuables emphasized both spiritual and political authority. Bronze swords and axes found in burial contexts demonstrate that martial skill was both a personal asset and a symbol of communal leadership, underpinning the social hierarchy that facilitated organized raiding. Interactions with neighboring regions reflect the dual role of military expansion in both conflict and alliance formation. Evidence of imported metals, amber, and stylistically influenced artifacts indicates that military activity did not operate in isolation from trade and diplomacy. Scandinavian elites appear to have used martial capability to secure favorable exchange relations, control key nodes in continental networks, and negotiate influence over resources. Archaeological data suggests that raiding, territorial assertion, and trade were interconnected, with elite leadership guiding both coercive and economic strategies. Fortifications and hordes also suggest long-term territorial strategy rather than short-term opportunistic attacks. Hilltop enclosures and palisade settlements were often maintained for decades, implying sustained investment in defensive and offensive infrastructure. Chemical and isotopic analyses of weapon artifacts indicate sourcing of bronze from distant regions, further demonstrating that military expansion was underpinned by control over trade networks and access to essential resources. These findings illustrate how geography, resource management, and martial organization combine to facilitate regional dominance. The role of rivers and coastal routes in enabling organized raiding was particularly significant. Canoes and small watercraft allowed rapid mobilization of warriors, supply transport, and surprise attacks, linking geographical knowledge to strategic advantage. Settlements along fjords, estuaries, and river mouths often contained storage pits for both food and arms, indicating logistical planning to sustain prolonged campaigns. Archaeological surveys demonstrate that elite-controlled waterways served as arteries of both trade and military influence, consolidating power for communities with access to navigable terrain. By the end of this period, southern Scandinavian societies had established the infrastructure and social organization necessary for coordinated military campaigns and territorial expansion. Evidence from weapon hordes, fortifications, and settlement patterns indicates that expansion was deliberate, elite-driven, and intertwined with economic and ritual life. Warrior elites leveraged geography and resources to project authority, securing trade routes and asserting influence over strategic locations. Expansion fueled contact with other Bronze Age societies, influencing culture and trade. The projection of martial power facilitated access to imported metals, stylistic motifs, and ritual knowledge, reinforcing elite authority and shaping the social, economic, and symbolic landscape of the Nordic Bronze Age. This integration of military capability with regional interaction set the stage for the peak of Nordic power and cultural expression in the following centuries. Even within prosperous landscapes, competition and conflict shaped political landscapes. By the late 8th and early 7th centuries BCE, southern Scandinavian communities faced increasing socio-political pressures as population growth, resource demands, and expanding trade networks intensified regional rivalries. Archaeological evidence indicates that fortified hilltops, palisade settlements, and elevated longhouse compounds were constructed or reinforced during this period, reflecting heightened concern over territorial defense. Sites in Zealand, southern Sweden, and central Denmark display repeated rebuilding of defensive structures, suggesting ongoing localized conflicts rather than isolated incidents. Competition for agricultural land and pasture was a primary driver of these conflicts. Paleoenvironmental studies show that optimal arable land was limited in certain regions, particularly river valleys and coastal plains. Settlement surveys reveal clusters of farmsteads and longhouse complexes concentrated near fertile areas, creating densely populated zones. The resulting competition for soil, water access, and grazing areas likely prompted disputes between neighboring communities. Archaeologists note that hilltop enclosures were often positioned to oversee both fertile lands and trade routes, indicating strategic placement to protect critical resources. Trade networks also became focal points for regional rivalry. Evidence from hordes and settlement distribution indicates that control over access to imported tin, copper, and amber conferred both economic and political advantage. Fortifications located near river crossings or coastal inlets provided not only defensive capability but also control over commerce. Communities with access to these strategic points could regulate the flow of high-value materials, reinforcing elite authority while provoking competition with neighboring settlements seeking similar advantages. Material culture reflects the influence of competition on social structures. Burials from this period include weapons, bronze swords, axes, and spearheads, frequently accompanied by ornamentation indicating elite status. The concentration of these items in specific graves suggests that warrior elites played a central role in both defense and territorial assertion. Iconographic evidence, including depictions of weapons and combat scenes on rock carvings and ceremonial artifacts, further reinforces the perception of an increasingly martial culture tied to social hierarchy and political influence. Evidence of skirmishes is apparent in settlement archaeology. Post-hole patterns, palisade repairs, and traces of burned structures indicate episodic conflict. Excavations at hill fort sites reveal multiple construction phases, with successive generations reinforcing walls, ditches, and gates. These findings imply that communities not only responded to immediate threats but also anticipated recurring pressure from rivals. Defensive architecture therefore represents both a practical adaptation and a material expression of regional tension. Elite households appear to have coordinated both economic and martial resources in response to these pressures. Longhouses with attached storage areas for grain, metal, and weapons suggest centralized management of resources necessary for sustaining conflict. The combination of controlled food supply, crafted bronze weaponry, and strategic settlement placement reflects a systemic approach to regional competition. Archaeological data demonstrate that elite authority became increasingly reliant on the ability to mobilize labor and resources for both defense and offense. Environmental factors contributed to socio-political stress as well. Climatic fluctuations during this period, including cooler temperatures and shorter growing seasons, may have exacerbated competition for land and resources. Pollen cores and sediment analyses show shifts in forest composition and agricultural productivity, implying that communities faced periods of scarcity. This pressure likely intensified rivalries, compelling elites to maintain fortified settlements, assert control over strategic trade routes, and manage labor to ensure community survival. By the end of this period, southern Scandinavian societies exhibited heightened awareness of regional competition and the necessity of organized defense. Fortifications, elite weapon caches, and settlement placement indicate that communities strategically adapted to both resource pressures and economic rivalry. The combination of population density, trade interest, and environmental fluctuation created a socio-political landscape in which competition was a persistent driver of innovation in defense, governance, and elite coordination. Stress from regional competition accelerates social and political adaptation, laying the groundwork for more centralized authority, integrated trade management, and standardized ceremonial practices that characterize the subsequent peak of the Nordic Bronze Age. Even the Bronze Age was vulnerable to climate's silent pressure. Between 700 and 600 BCE, dendrochronological studies and paleoclimatic data reveal that southern Scandinavia experienced episodes of cooler, wetter conditions. Tree-ring analyses from oak and pine sequences indicate periods of reduced growth, consistent with shorter growing seasons and increased precipitation. Sediment cores from bogs and lakes show higher water tables and evidence of soil erosion, suggesting that agricultural productivity may have been compromised in low-lying fields. These environmental fluctuations coincided with a period of population growth and intensified resource use, creating conditions in which communities faced increasing pressure to maintain food security. Agricultural systems, already structured for surplus production, were particularly sensitive to climatic variability. Crop yields from barley, emmer wheat, and rye likely fluctuated year by year, affecting both subsistence and the storage required to sustain elite households. Faunal evidence indicates that livestock management may also have been challenged by wetter conditions, as pasture quality declined and waterlogged fields limited grazing options. Such constraints would have compounded the stress on communities reliant on a combination of cereals and livestock for both daily subsistence and tradable surplus. Social tension likely intensified as environmental stress intersected with pre-existing competition for land and resources. Paleoethnobotanical and settlement evidence indicates that fertile river valleys and coastal plains were already densely occupied. Reduced agricultural output may have exacerbated disputes over access to arable plots, water, and pasture, reinforcing the construction and maintenance of defensive structures, including palisades, hilltop enclosures, and fortified longhouse complexes. Archaeological data suggests that elite households may have increasingly intervened in resource allocation to mitigate social unrest and maintain authority. Paleoclimatic reconstructions suggest that wetter, cooler conditions may have had cascading effects on trade and mobility. Riverine and coastal transport routes, essential for moving grain, livestock, and bronze, would have been affected by flooding or sedimentation. Seasonal disruptions could have delayed the exchange of goods, limiting elite access to imported copper, tin, and luxury items. These interruptions in trade may have reinforced social hierarchies, as elites controlled access to scarce resources and directed labor for storage and redistribution during periods of environmental stress. Material culture reflects adaptation to environmental pressures. Burial deposits and hoards from this period show continued accumulation of bronze weapons, ceremonial objects, and prestige goods, suggesting that elite households maintained wealth and authority despite agricultural challenges. This pattern indicates that social stratification provided a buffer against environmental uncertainty, allowing elites to mobilize labor and resources to protect both communities and trade networks. Elite control over production and storage was therefore critical in sustaining social cohesion under adverse conditions. Evidence from rock carvings and ritual deposits further underscores the perceived connection between environmental change and ritual practice. Certain petroglyph sites and ceremonial hoards appear to emphasize fertility symbols, solar motifs, and water-related imagery, possibly reflecting concerns over crop productivity and ecological balance. Archaeologists interpret these symbolic practices as responses to environmental variability, integrating ritual observance into strategies for community resilience and social negotiation during periods of scarcity. By the end of this century, climate and environmental change had become central factors shaping social, economic, and political dynamics. Cooler, wetter conditions placed pressure on agricultural systems, intensified competition for fertile land, and disrupted trade networks. Communities responded through fortified settlements, elite resource management, and ritual practices designed to reinforce cohesion. Archaeological and paleo-environmental evidence demonstrates that environmental stress was not an isolated factor, but an integrated component influencing settlement planning, economic organization, and hierarchical authority. Environmental stress contributed to changes in trade, migration, and social hierarchy, accelerating adaptive strategies that would influence the Nordic Bronze Age's economic and political structures in subsequent centuries. Communities adjusted both their physical infrastructure and social organization, linking climate pressures with long-term cultural and demographic developments. For a brief period, the Nordic world reached a level of wealth and organization unseen in the region before or after. By the 6th century BCE, archaeological evidence indicates that southern Scandinavia had achieved unprecedented levels of societal prosperity. Settlement surveys revealed dense networks of farmsteads, longhouses, and fortified sites, with clusters concentrated along river valleys, coastal plains, and other fertile regions. These networks suggest a high degree of coordination in land use, reflecting both population growth and the efficient allocation of resources. Pollen analysis and soil studies confirm that agricultural systems supported sustained crop yields, while faunal remains indicate carefully managed herds of cattle, sheep, and pigs, contributing to a reliable and diversified food supply. The organization of settlements demonstrates a balance between domestic, economic, and defensive needs. Longhouses, often measuring up to 30 meters in length, were arranged with granaries, stabling, and workspaces integrated into the overall plan, providing both storage and security. Hill forts and palisade compounds were strategically positioned to monitor trade routes, fertile fields, and river access, allowing communities to protect wealth and maintain social order. Archaeologists note that the continuity and scale of these settlements indicate long-term occupation, with repeated rebuilding suggesting sustained prosperity and investment in infrastructure. Trade and production were central to this peak period. Imported tin from Cornwall, copper from Central Europe, and Baltic amber circulated throughout southern Scandinavia, facilitated by riverine and coastal transport networks. Bronze workshops, evidenced by slag deposits, molds, and unfinished artifacts, demonstrate advanced metallurgical skill, while hoards indicate both production surpluses and ceremonial accumulation of wealth. The combination of local craft specialization, strategic trade, and resource management enabled elite households to assert authority while supporting broader community stability. Population estimates for this period suggest a substantial increase relative to earlier centuries. Archaeological data from settlement densities, house clusters, and burial sites indicate that communities were capable of sustaining larger populations through surplus production and coordinated resource allocation. Increased population density likely reinforced social stratification, as elites maintained control over surplus and specialized labor. This concentration of people and resources also allowed for more complex social organization, with clear hierarchies apparent in both domestic and ritual contexts. Material culture reflects both the prosperity and interconnectedness of this period. Elaborately decorated swords, axes, pins, and belt plates demonstrate not only technical skill, but also the role of prestige objects in signaling social status. Burial mounds and ceremonial deposits frequently contain imported goods alongside locally produced artifacts, illustrating the integration of wealth accumulation, ritual practice, and social display. Rock carvings, bronze figurines, and sun motifs further indicate that prosperity extended into cultural and religious expression, embedding elite authority within a visible and shared symbolic framework. Economic success was also evident in agricultural intensification. Expanded field systems, crop diversification, and the management of livestock provided consistent surpluses that supported specialized labor, craft production, and ceremonial activity. Archaeobotanical and faunal evidence indicate that communities optimized both crops and animal husbandry, creating resilience against local fluctuations in climate or soil fertility. The combination of surplus, labor organization, and resource redistribution allowed settlements to maintain high levels of stability and social cohesion during this peak period. The interconnectedness of trade, craft production, and social hierarchy created a feedback loop reinforcing prosperity. Elites controlled access to imported metals, directed labor for workshops, and oversaw storage and distribution of surplus, consolidating authority across settlements. Trade networks allowed communities to access luxury goods, raw materials, and stylistic influences, while surplus production underpinned both ritual and economic exchange. This integration demonstrates how material wealth, social organization, and technological skill combined to support a sustained peak of Nordic Bronze Age society. By the end of this period, southern Scandinavian communities had established a coherent, highly structured society characterized by demographic growth, economic stability, and hierarchical organization. Settlements, agricultural systems, trade networks, and elite-controlled production all contributed to a period of prosperity that enabled both material and symbolic expression on an unprecedented scale. Archaeological evidence indicates that this wealth was broadly distributed across key settlements, though always mediated by elite households who coordinated labor, resources, and ritual practice. Prosperity influenced art, religious practice, and cultural expression, providing the foundation for monumental ceremonial sites, intricate iconography, and standardized rituals. The alignment of material wealth, social hierarchy, and religious observance during this period demonstrates the culmination of centuries of technological, economic, and political development, setting the stage for both the peak and subsequent transformation of the Nordic Bronze Age. Bronze, stone, and ritual combined to reflect society's apex of cultural identity. During the period 600 to 500 BCE, southern Scandinavian communities expressed their peak social and economic achievements through monumental art and ceremonial constructions. Rock carvings across western Sweden, particularly at Tanum, demonstrate an unprecedented density and sophistication, with depictions of ships, chariots, animals, and solar motifs arranged in complex sequences. These petroglyphs not only reflect aesthetic refinement but also codify shared cosmological beliefs, linking maritime activity, seasonal cycles, and elite authority in a durable visual language. The repetition and standardization of motifs across regions indicate a broadly recognized symbolic system used to communicate social, religious, and political messages. Burial mounds reached their most elaborate form during this peak. Excavations at sites such as Haga, Borum Eshoj, and Egtft reveal large earthen and stone constructions containing elite burials accompanied by bronze weapons, pins, jewelry, and imported prestige items. Mounds were often located to dominate the surrounding landscape, signaling both wealth and social control. The scale and labor investment required for these monuments suggest coordinated efforts of multiple households under elite supervision. These constructions reinforced social hierarchies while serving as focal points for ritual activity, bridging the material and symbolic realms. Bronze ceremonial objects also illustrate the refinement of craft and symbolism. Artifacts such as belt plates, figurines, and axe-shaped votive offerings combine technical sophistication with codified iconography. Casting techniques enabled fine detail, while standardized motifs, sun wheels, ships, and animals, conveyed cosmological narratives intelligible across communities. Many objects were deposited in wetland areas or hoards, suggesting ritual dedication as part of wider religious practice. Chemical analyses confirm that some bronze originated from long-distance trade networks, demonstrating the integration of production, exchange, and ceremonial purpose. The codification of artistic motifs during this period reflects a convergence of economic prosperity, elite authority, and religious observance. Elite households controlled both production and display of ceremonial objects, directing labor and resources to create visually and symbolically coherent artifacts. Rock carvings, burial mounds, and bronze objects collectively established a visual vocabulary that communicated social cohesion, hierarchical authority, and cosmological understanding. The widespread adoption of these motifs indicates a shared cultural identity across southern Scandinavia. Monumental art also served functional social purposes. Petroglyph panels located near trade routes, river crossings, and settlement clusters acted as markers of territory and influence, communicating status and shared beliefs to observers. Similarly, ceremonial mounds and votive deposits reinforced elite control over ritual spaces and the management of surplus resources. By aligning visual display with social, economic, and religious authority, communities codified a complex system of symbols that guided behavior, reinforced hierarchy, and legitimized leadership. Artistic and ceremonial practices were deeply intertwined with ritual and religious life. Iconography emphasizes solar cycles, fertility, maritime travel, and animal symbolism, suggesting structured cosmological frameworks. The combination of visual representation, material investment, and landscape placement indicates that ritual activity extended beyond the immediate household, engaging wider community participation. Archaeologists note that repeated deposition of bronze objects and maintenance of mound structures over generations demonstrates both continuity of practice and the enduring role of elite oversight. By the end of this peak period, southern Scandinavian societies had established a highly sophisticated cultural and ceremonial infrastructure. Monumental art, standardized iconography, and elaborately constructed burial mounds reflected both material prosperity and social cohesion. Visual culture codified religious, political, and economic hierarchies, providing a durable record of societal values and priorities. The integration of production, display, and ritual demonstrates how economic surplus and elite authority enabled cultural sophistication unprecedented in the Nordic Bronze Age. Cultural apex precedes pressures leading to decline. While artistic and ceremonial expression reached its zenith, emerging social, environmental, and economic stresses would challenge the structures that supported this prosperity. The next centuries would witness changes in settlement patterns, trade connectivity, and social organization, marking the transition from the Nordic Bronze Age peak toward eventual contraction and transformation. As trade routes shifted, wealth and power began to ebb from Nordic communities. By the early 5th century BCE, Evidence indicates that southern Scandinavian societies were experiencing a marked contraction in long-distance trade networks that had underpinned the prosperity of the previous century. Archaeological data show a decline in imported materials such as tin from Cornwall, copper from Central Europe, and luxury goods associated with elite display. Chemical analyses of bronze artifacts reveal a shift toward locally sourced materials and recycled bronze, suggesting that external connections had diminished while local production persisted at a reduced scale. Settlement surveys indicate corresponding changes in wealth distribution. Hoard deposits, once abundant and concentrated near elite longhouses or ceremonial sites, become less frequent and smaller in size. This reduction reflects not only lower availability of imported materials but also declining capacity for surplus accumulation, signaling an economic contraction affecting both elites and the broader population. Archaeologists also note that workshops producing bronze tools and ceremonial items show fewer production layers and less technical refinement, indicating that resource scarcity influenced both output and craftsmanship. Trade disruption was likely driven by a combination of internal and external factors. Competition among emerging European polities, shifting trade corridors, and changing demand for bronze contributed to reduced imports. Coastal and riverine settlements that had previously functioned as hubs of exchange show evidence of partial abandonment or repurposing, suggesting that communities were responding to altered regional networks. Archaeological patterns indicate a reorientation of economic activity toward local exchange, emphasizing subsistence and internal redistribution rather than expansive continental trade. Despite these challenges, local production and craft specialization continued, albeit at a diminished scale. Bronze casting remained an important activity, evidenced by residual slag deposits, molds, and unfinished artifacts in settlements. Artisans adapted to resource limitations by recycling older bronze and prioritizing functional objects over highly decorative prestige goods. This adjustment indicates that while long-distance trade declined, the technical knowledge and social frameworks necessary for production persisted, allowing communities to maintain a degree of continuity in craft and economic activity. Economic contraction also affected agricultural and settlement patterns. Archaeobotanical data indicate a modest reduction in the intensity of crop cultivation, while faunal remains suggest smaller herd sizes and less structured breeding practices. Settlement density in previously prosperous valleys and coastal areas declined, with some longhouse clusters abandoned or reduced in size. These shifts imply that population pressure, previously managed through surplus production and coordinated trade, now faced constraints, leading to more localized subsistence strategies. Elite households were particularly affected by trade disruption. Reduced access to imported bronze and other high-value items limited the ability of elites to maintain social distinction through material display. Burial practices reflect this change. Grave goods are fewer and less elaborate, and hoard compositions emphasize local bronze over exotic imports. This transformation signals a recalibration of social hierarchies, as elite authority became increasingly dependent on control of local resources rather than continental networks. Despite the decline, evidence suggests that communities remained resilient. Internal trade and exchange of surplus continued within regional networks, supporting essential craft production and ritual practices. Archaeological finds indicate that ceremonial deposits persisted, though scaled down in size and frequency, reflecting adaptation to constrained material conditions. Local communities maintained cultural practices and social cohesion even as broader economic connections waned. By the end of this century, southern Scandinavian societies were navigating a transitional phase characterized by economic contraction, trade disruption, and reduced surplus. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that long-distance networks that had fueled prosperity during the peak of the Nordic Bronze Age had largely shifted or dissolved, leading to diminished wealth accumulation and changes in settlement density. Local production, while continued, operated at a smaller scale, signaling both continuity and adaptation. Diminished resources lead to social and political decentralization, setting the stage for the reorganization of communities and authority structures. The contraction of trade and reduction in surplus shifted the balance of power away from elite households that had relied on imported wealth, favoring more localized control and adaptive strategies that would shape the transition into the subsequent Iron Age. Communities dispersed, leaving monumental centers to fade into the landscape. By the 5th century BCE, archaeological surveys indicate a marked reorganization of settlement patterns in southern Scandinavia. Large, centralized farmsteads and longhouse complexes that had dominated fertile valleys and coastal plains during the peak of the Nordic Bronze Age were gradually abandoned or reduced in size. Excavations reveal smaller, more dispersed clusters of households, often positioned on less prominent terrain or marginal farmland. This shift suggests a decentralization of population and authority, reflecting both environmental pressures and diminished economic centrality. Hill forts and palisade settlements, once integral to defense and elite control, show evidence of abandonment or repurposing during this period. Excavated ramparts display reduced maintenance, and palisades are often partially dismantled or used as boundary markers for smaller farmsteads. Sites such as those in central Zealand and southern Sweden reveal occupation layers that thin toward the end of this period, indicating decreased use and strategic significance. Some former fortifications appear to have been converted to agricultural or storage purposes, highlighting adaptive reuse rather than total depopulation. Depopulation is evident in several regions. Settlement surveys in lowland river valleys demonstrate a reduction in the number of occupied longhouses, while upland or marginal areas see sporadic establishment of small farmsteads. Archaeobotanical and faunal data indicate that these smaller communities relied on mixed subsistence strategies, combining limited cereal cultivation with livestock management to maintain self-sufficiency. This contrasts with earlier periods, where surplus production supported larger populations and centralized craft and trade hubs. Migration patterns during this period are also apparent. Some evidence suggests relocation toward more fertile or better drained lands, as previously intensively used fields became exhausted or vulnerable to environmental fluctuation. Dendrochronological studies and soil analyses support the interpretation that population movement was at least partially driven by declining agricultural productivity, with communities seeking optimal conditions for both crops and livestock. Settlement dispersal appears to have been gradual, reflecting adaptive responses rather than abrupt abandonment. The decentralization of settlement correlates with shifts in social and political organization. As populations became smaller and more dispersed, elite households lost the capacity to coordinate labor over extensive areas, reducing centralized control. Burial practices during this period demonstrate simplification, with fewer large mounds and hoards, and an increased prevalence of modest grave markers within smaller communities. This evidence suggests that ritual and social display became more localized, mirroring the redistribution of population and resources. Changes in trade and craft production further reinforce the interpretation of dispersed settlement. Smaller farmsteads show limited evidence of specialized workshops or large-scale bronze production, indicating a contraction of elite-sponsored craft activity. While local metallurgy persisted, the scale and complexity of production declined, consistent with reduced labor pools and a focus on subsistence rather than surplus accumulation. Smaller communities maintained basic economic networks but lacked the capacity to replicate the long-distance trade systems that had previously supported social hierarchy and monumental construction. By the end of this transitional century, southern Scandinavian settlements were characterized by reduced centralization, dispersed farmsteads, and diminished occupation of former elite or ceremonial centers. Archaeological evidence indicates that these shifts were widespread, affecting both fertile lowlands and previously strategic highlands. Population redistribution, combined with the contraction of trade and production, reshaped the social landscape, reducing the visibility and influence of previously dominant communities. Population shifts coincide with transformations in ritual and political organization. As communities dispersed, centralized elite authority weakened, ceremonial sites became less prominent, and local social structures adapted to smaller, more self-sufficient households. The dispersal of settlements reflects broader societal adjustments, connecting demographic change to the economic, political, and cultural reorganization that defined the decline and transition from the Nordic Bronze Age to the early Iron Age. Centuries later, the stones and bronzes would tell the story of a forgotten world. The Nordic Bronze Age, long buried beneath forests, soil, and centuries of later settlement, first emerged in the consciousness of modern scholarship during the 19th century. Archaeologists and antiquarians began systematically documenting burial mounds, hoards, and rock carvings, gradually revealing the material culture of a civilization that had flourished in southern Scandinavia over a millennium earlier. In Denmark, Sophus Mahler was instrumental in cataloging Bronze Age sites, producing detailed descriptions of mounds, artifacts, and settlement traces. His work laid the foundation for a chronological framework that connected scattered finds into coherent regional patterns. In Sweden, attention focused on the western coast, where the Tanum region yielded thousands of petroglyphs depicting ships, animals, chariots, and solar motifs. Researchers applied careful survey techniques, photographing and drawing carvings to record both individual motifs and their spatial arrangement across panels. These efforts demonstrated that rock art was not random decoration but an organized symbolic system reflecting social, religious, and cosmological ideas. Swedish archaeologists emphasized the interplay between landscape, visibility, and symbolic meaning, noting that carvings were often located near waterways, settlement areas, or elevated vantage points. The study of Bronze Age hoards further advanced understanding of social and economic structures. Archaeologists analyzed the composition of bronze artifacts, distinguishing between locally produced items and those made from imported metals such as tin from Cornwall or copper from Central Europe. Chemical and isotopic analyses allowed researchers to trace supply networks, revealing connections across the European continent. Large hoards, often containing swords, axes, pins, and ornaments, provided insight into elite accumulation, ritual deposition, and the social significance of material culture. Excavations of burial mounds complemented hoard studies, showing how grave goods reflected status, gender, and occupation. Methodological innovations during the 20th and 21st centuries enhanced the interpretation of Bronze Age evidence. Dendrochronology and radiocarbon dating established precise chronological frameworks for settlements, burial mounds, and ritual deposits. Pollen analysis and sediment cores reconstructed environmental conditions, demonstrating the impact of climate, soil, and vegetation on settlement patterns and subsistence strategies. Archaeobotanical and faunal studies clarified agricultural and livestock management, while spatial analysis of settlements and hill forts revealed patterns of population density, territorial organization, and defensive strategy. Rock carvings continued to offer unique insights into symbolic and ritual life. Modern imaging techniques, including 3D scanning and photogrammetry, allowed archaeologists to record subtle variations in carving depth and orientation, providing evidence of repeated activity, seasonal observances, or hierarchical emphasis of certain motifs. Comparative studies across regions demonstrated shared iconographic themes, confirming that Bronze Age communities maintained a coherent symbolic vocabulary spanning southern Scandinavia. Researchers interpreted motifs such as ships, chariots, and solar wheels in relation to mobility, cosmology, and elite authority, revealing the interconnection of material culture and social structure. The integration of these diverse data sources transformed understanding of the Nordic Bronze Age. Archaeologists combined artifact typologies, settlement surveys, environmental reconstructions, and symbolic analysis to construct a multidimensional view of society. This approach demonstrated the interplay of economy, craft specialization, political organization, religious belief, and cultural expression. Excavated evidence showed how technological innovation, trade networks, and elite oversight shaped societal development, while artistic and ceremonial expression reflected both social cohesion and symbolic communication. Key figures in archaeological research emphasized both systematic excavation and careful interpretation. Sophus Mahler's pioneering work in Denmark established the principle of cataloging sites and artifacts, while Swedish researchers such as Gunnar Ekholm and later teams at Tanum advanced the study of rock art and symbolic landscapes. International collaboration and comparative analysis with Central European and Baltic Bronze Age cultures further contextualized Nordic developments, revealing shared technological, social, and artistic trends across regions. Through successive generations of study, Bronze Age sites became more than static collections of objects. They provide a narrative of societal evolution, demonstrating how communities adapted to environmental, economic, and political conditions. Interpretation of burial practices, hoards, settlements, and art has allowed scholars to reconstruct demographic trends, social hierarchy, trade networks, and religious systems. These findings illustrate the processes by which prehistory is translated into coherent historical understanding, connecting fragments of material culture into a comprehensive account of human activity. Understanding the past informs both historical scholarship and cultural identity. The rediscovery and analysis of Nordic Bronze Age material has shaped national heritage, inspired museum exhibitions, and influenced contemporary interpretations of prehistoric life. Archaeology demonstrates that prehistory is not a static dark period, but a dynamic era characterized by technological innovation, social complexity, and cultural expression. Modern methods, rigorous excavation, and critical analysis continue to refine this picture, ensuring that the legacy of the Nordic Bronze Age remains accessible to both scholars and the public. The Bronze Age echoes through Nordic culture, influencing myth, art, and national memory. The material culture, symbolism, and social organization of the Nordic Bronze Age left a durable imprint on subsequent Scandinavian societies. Iconography such as solar motifs, ship depictions, and chariot imagery persisted in cultural memory, influencing later artistic traditions and mythological frameworks. Evidence from the Viking Age demonstrates continued reverence for ships and solar symbolism, with longships and sundials reflecting continuity in visual and cosmological themes. Petroglyphs and ceremonial deposits of the Bronze Age appear to have informed the symbolic vocabulary that underpinned Nordic mythology and ritual practice centuries later. Artifacts and imagery from the Bronze Age were incorporated into local narratives during the early Iron Age and Viking Age. Archaeological studies of hoards and burial practices indicate that symbolic motifs continued to carry social and religious meaning. Bronze casting techniques influenced later metalwork in the Nordic region, with stylistic elements appearing in Iron Age brooches, weapons, and ritual objects. The integration of Bronze Age motifs into later art suggests both conscious emulation and inherited symbolic frameworks, demonstrating a cultural continuity across centuries. Mythological reception of Bronze Age themes is evident in Scandinavian sagas and folklore. Ship imagery, for instance, retained associations with mobility, social status, and cosmology, appearing in narratives of sea voyages and elite heroism. Solar motifs evolved into metaphors for cyclical time, fertility, and divine authority. While direct textual evidence from the Bronze Age is absent, these later references indicate that visual and ritual culture contributed to collective memory, embedding social values and cosmological ideas into enduring cultural frameworks. Modern scholarship has emphasized the role of the Bronze Age in shaping national and regional identity. Excavation of burial mounds, hoards, and petroglyphs during the 19th and 20th centuries coincided with burgeoning interest in Nordic heritage, particularly in Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. Museums, publications, and exhibitions highlighted Bronze Age artifacts as emblematic of early Scandinavian ingenuity, craftsmanship, and social complexity. The aesthetic and technological achievements of the period became foundational to modern understandings of national history, influencing both academic study and popular perception of the Nordic past. Archaeological continuity underscores the functional and symbolic persistence of Bronze Age practices. Rock carvings depicting ships and chariots provided models for ritual and artistic representation in later periods, while burial traditions influenced subsequent approaches to elite commemoration. Comparative studies demonstrate that Bronze Age motifs were selectively retained, adapted, or reinterpreted to suit the needs of later communities, illustrating the dynamic interplay between material culture and collective memory. Material artifacts also served as tangible links across centuries. Hoards recovered in later periods were sometimes repurposed or reburied, suggesting an awareness of their ancestral significance. Bronze objects, in particular, remained objects of symbolic and practical value, bridging technological, social, and ideological frameworks. The circulation and deposition of such items reinforced intergenerational continuity, and highlighted the enduring prestige associated with Bronze Age craftsmanship. By the Viking Age, many Bronze Age themes had become embedded in a broader cultural identity. Ship motifs persisted as central elements in funerary, artistic, and ritual contexts. Solar symbolism informed calendrical and religious practices. The integration of these motifs into material culture, myth, and ceremony demonstrates that Bronze Age innovations were not merely historical artifacts but active components in the construction of social and cultural narratives. The legacy of the Nordic Bronze Age continues to inform modern scholarship and public understanding. Archaeologists interpret the material record to trace social hierarchies, technological innovation, trade networks, and religious practice. Cultural institutions preserve and display Bronze Age artifacts as both scholarly resources and symbols of Nordic heritage. This ongoing engagement demonstrates that the Bronze Age remains a living component of cultural identity, linking contemporary Scandinavia with its prehistoric past. Legacy of material culture and social organization informs broader European Bronze Age studies. The integration of settlement patterns, trade networks, metallurgical innovation, and symbolic systems in southern Scandinavia provides comparative frameworks for understanding Bronze Age development across Europe. Northern societies demonstrate how geographic, environmental, and social factors converge to produce durable cultural expressions, contributing to broader historical narratives of technological adaptation, trade, and ritual continuity. If you found this exploration of the Nordic Bronze Age insightful, consider subscribing for more evidence-based historical documentaries. Hit the notification bell to follow our chronological journeys through ancient civilizations, and join us in uncovering the societies that shaped the world we know today.